First of all, thank you for the opportunity to give you this presentation. I will present together with Karin Klein, who is at the right side of me. She conducted a large part of the study at the Dutch Consumer and Safety Institute. And Elliot Fishman also contributed. He has also conducted a large review study on electric bicycles. So for the discussion on, for instance, health effects, that may also be interesting. The title of the presentation is The Safety of Electrically Assisted Bicycles Compared to Classic Bicycles, or conventional bicycles, if you like. We have abbreviated it as EBs and CBs. Well, to start, firstly, if you get this research question, in the ideal world, you would start with official registrations, mostly police statistics and national travel surveys. But unfortunately, the problem of underreporting has already been mentioned. Henk even mentioned that in the Netherlands, by comparing with cause of death statistics, we found out that even severe fatal motor vehicle crashes, fatal bicycle crashes without motor vehicles were not reported by the police. So that makes it difficult to use the data sources you would normally use. It's now just being introduced in the National Travel Survey, but not well enough to use that for our study. So we had to do it otherwise. So we involved the Dutch Consumer and Safety Institute because they have a sample of emergency departments and they can spread questionnaires among people treated at the emergency department after a bicycle crash. So that's the first part of the study. Now, if you want to study crash severity, then that's already a very good source. So that's crash severity is one of the issues we studied. We also want to study the risk of being involved in a crash. So then you need something to compare it with, because everybody was involved in a crash if they were treated at the emergency department. So we also disseminated a large questionnaire by one of the largest panel companies in the Netherlands. So those cyclists without any known crash involvements served as a control group. So that's the basic design of the study. So how does it work? Right. Yeah. So the reason for conducting this study, well, we see an increasing use of electric bicycles, I think everywhere, and especially also in the Netherlands. There's a graph at the bottom with the share of cyclists indicating that they sometimes or very often use an electric bicycle. And you see here at the right side of the graph that in 2016, almost a quarter of all cyclists indicate that they sometimes or now and then use an electric bicycle. In our study, we used the definition of using an electric bicycle for at least half of all your kilometers traveled. So then we classified the cyclist as an electric bicycle user. So then the percentage is slightly lower than the percentage here shown in this graph. First of all, I didn't mention the definition, but we defined electric bicycles according to the European legislation, which means pedal assistance up to 25 kilometers per hour. And we did not include speed pedelecs, which are now being introduced and have maximum assistance up to 45 kilometers per hour. So that's a completely different story in terms of safety, of course. It's very important to look at this rise of electric bicycles because it's particularly used by vulnerable elderly. We see a rise of bicycle kilometers, particularly among the elderly in the Netherlands. And that's not the main focus of this study. We look at crash severity and injury risk, controlling for age. But the fact that older vulnerable people are using this electric bicycle means that no matter what the risk is, that it means that we are having more severe injuries in the Netherlands. So that's an important effect, but it's not an effect that we discuss in this paper. So clearly there's a need for knowledge. So what do people usually believe? Well, the main idea is that electric bicycles are a bit faster, so it's more dangerous, and if you're involved in a crash, then it's also more likely to be severe. So that's the popular belief. So that's also the research, those two aspects are also the research questions we looked at. The research questions are, does crash likelihood differ between electric bicycle users and users of conventional bicycles? And does crash severity differ if you're involved in a crash? So what we essentially did is, again, we had this questionnaire disseminated among patients treated at the emergency department in a sample of 14 hospitals in the Netherlands. And we had this questionnaire disseminated by a panel company among normal cyclists without any known crash involvement. So what the study comes down to is two comparisons. Firstly, we looked at whether electric bicycle users were more likely to be victims treated at an emergency department than users of conventional bicycles. And a similar comparison was made for victims treated at emergency departments. We looked at whether users of electric bicycles were more likely to be hospitalized after their treatment at the emergency department than users of conventional bicycles. So just to give you a bit more context of the study was conducted in the Netherlands, which has a very high bicycle model share, 26%. If you describe cycling safety in the Netherlands, we see that the number of cyclist deaths over the last decade has been about constant, no decrease unfortunately, and we see quite a steep rise of the number of serious injuries, and you see that in the graph at the bottom. It's a bit difficult to make an estimation of the last years, but from the numbers it's clear that there's still unfortunately a rise. So again, this again shows the need for more knowledge. So that's why the Transport Ministry in the Netherlands commissioned this study. One thing I should also mention in terms of context. So it's conducted in the Netherlands, and we have this European legislation. And our perception is that the practice is quite in line with legislation. So the users are actually using bikes without really tempering the motor power. So it's 25 or maybe 26 is really the maximum. And it's important to note that because I also saw a presentation from Israel, and they apparently apply the same legislation as the Netherlands. But they imported a lot of electric bicycles from China, which are under a different legislation. And even though the official legislation is the same, a lot of people were driving well above this 25 kilometers per hour speed limit. So these results are not transferable to, for instance, a country like Israel because of that. And they're not transferable to China either because they have a different legislation, higher speed. So that's something to bear in mind. The conclusions, first I will now discuss what's already known from the literature. In 2013, we conducted a study which was almost similar. The only difference with the current study is that we included more control variables. We looked at more of the personal characteristics, for instance, whether people are having health problems. And we also controlled better for exposure. And Karin tell more about that in the results, part of the results. Now, the conclusions in 2013 that we published in Accident Analysis and Prevention were that electric bicycle users were more likely to be treated at an emergency department after a crash, an indication of an elevated risk. And crash severity did not differ between users of conventional bicycles and classic bicycles and electric bicycles. So it's very interesting now to see with more control variables whether we arrive at the same conclusions, and Karin will tell you more about that in the second part. Now, we're not, if you look in the literature, we're not aware of other studies that look at crash risk, which is not surprising because it's quite difficult to get a sample of both victims and controls. So it requires a different type of study. But there are several other studies that looked at crash severity, and it's a bit easier to study because if you have a good sample of hospitalized patients or emergency treatments at the emergency departments, you can look whether the share of hospitalized patients is higher or not. Now we see that two other studies also came to the same conclusion, that there's no difference in crash severity. And those were also studies conducted in a European context with the same legislation. But a different conclusion was achieved in China, where electric bicycles are allowed to ride at higher speeds. And in China, crash severity did differ. So users of electric bicycles had more severe crashes than users of conventional bicycles. This is just the crash research. You can also look at other types of research to see what the working ingredients are underlying safety. Now, first thing to look at, of course, is cruising speed. Does cruising speed differ? Well, we see that electric bicycle users are between 1 and 3 kilometers per hour faster. It's in general unfavorable for safety, but on the other hand, if you ride uphill, especially for older people, it's more easy to gain a speed where bicycles are self-stable, so to say. So that's helpful. So it's difficult to draw a firm hypothesis on this. E-bikes are about 5 kilograms heavier than classical bicycles because of the battery. The weight distribution is also different, and there has been quite some research over the recent years on mounting and dismounting, because older cyclists are very frequently involved in crashes while mounting or dismounting. And SWOF did good experimental research on that. Now it appears that the electric bicycle is less stable in the initial mounting phase when you get on your bike because of this weight problem and weight distribution. But on the other hand, after you mounted the bicycle, it's a bit more easy to speed up. So in that phase, it's a bit helpful, especially for older people, to gain stable speed. So again, it's difficult to draw a firm conclusion. Another hypothesis is that more technical hypothesis. It applies especially on e-bikes sold some time ago. It's now changing. But some time ago, a lot of the fleet was had front wheel traction, and it was easy to skid because of that. At least it could be the case, because you need your front wheel to stabilize your bicycle. So if it accelerates through the front wheel fast, then it's more likely that you will skid in a curve. But we're not sure. It's just a hypothesis. And then finally, we also have evidence that electric bicycle users are different from classical bicycle users. Of course, they're older, but even if you control for their age, it appears that they're more likely to have more morbid conditions and more likely to be obese. So it's interesting also to use those factors as confounding variables in your analysis to see whether that may explain some of the risk differences. So that's where I give the floor to Karin. No.
Thank you, Paul. Okay. Paul just said, actually, we conducted this study amongst victims of the emergency department and among a control group. We had over 2,300 victims, and we had a little over 1,800 people in a control group. And as you can see, most of them in both groups had classical bicycles, but in both groups, a large part as well did have an electrical bike. We conducted, Paul already mentioned this as well. We selected from the DIS, the Dutch Injury Surveillance System, which consists of 14 hospitals. We asked the people, or I should say the hospitals, I was going to say something, well, never mind. Patients got a questionnaire at their home, and they could answer it online or on paper. The questionnaire consisted of more than 60 or almost 60 questions and was about circumstances and effects, and also obviously about the causes of the accident. And we had a response rate of 38%. Which was quite a lot for that kind of study. In the control group, it was Kantar, one of the largest panel survey companies. They had a response of a little over 50%, 45%. And they were asked like similar questions, obviously not about the accident because they didn't have an accident, but about health issues, medicine use, and of course about the use of the bicycle and how much and how often do they ride the bicycle. As Paul already said, we classified the EB users if they rode over more than half of their total cycle distance on an e-bike. So that's how we did it. And then, as we all know, if you're conducting a survey, there could be selective non-response. So we were controlling or correcting for that kind of issues. We used weighting factors. With the DIS study, we looked at the original DIS population, and we saw that, for instance, more women participated in the study and more elderly people. So we had to correct for that, and we did the same with the control group, but we did not use the DIS study, obviously, but we used the general information from the. Yeah, we call it the CBS. How do you call it, Paul? Statistics analysis. It's so easy. So we made a correction with that as well. Two analysis I will tell you about today. Firstly, the crash likelihood, in which we look at the victims versus the control group, and then the injury severity, in which we look at the hospital admittance versus the emergency department only. This is a table nobody will be able to read, and that's not that wasn't the purpose. So it was the main purpose was to show you the amount of variables we used in the equation. We used a binary logistic regression, and the most important thing I wanted to show you, and I hope this is better. If you look at it, you can read it. The most important thing we have found in our analysis is that there was a difference between classical bicycles and electric bicycles if you look at crash likelihood, but we know, for instance, and it has been elaborated on this morning already, that exposure is a main and very important factor. If we put that in the equation as well, because we didn't in this one, then the difference between the classical bicycle accidents and the electric bicycle accidents, they disappear. So that is very, I don't know if it was surprising, maybe not so. That's the main finding. We see that the classical bicycle users, or the electrical bicycle users, they cycle more than the classical bicycle users. Let me see. Well, then the injury severity. Again, the table isn't worth looking at. It's you can't read it. It's again about the number of confounders we put in the equation. The injury severity. We're looking at the hospital admittance versus the people who weren't admitted to the hospital. So after being treated at an ED, they went home. Again, we find no difference in injury severity after controlling for the factors such as gender, age, usage of the bike. So we didn't find any difference between the two types. And then we had a third analysis as well. We looked at mounting and dismounting, as Paul already said. That in literature it is found that there could be a difference, or we see in our study as well that many people using using an e-bike had more accidents while mounting or dismounting. And again, in this study, we have found, after putting all the confounders in the equation, that we did not find any difference between the two groups. So, I guess I can be very short about that. The conclusion is that we have found no difference and in crash likelihood and injury severity, so which made us conclude that the crashes are more or less the same. As with the dismounting accidents. And if you look at the recommendations, we could conclude that if you look at the main measurements or things that are measures that are taken on traffic safety, they will benefit e-bike users as well, because we did not find any differences. So that is I guess, a main and important finding, because you don't have to do something specific for people who are riding an e-bike. And well, we also say that maybe it is wise to, if you look at the mounting and dismounting, although we find no difference between electronic bicycles and classical bicycles, we do find that there are many accidents with mounting and dismounting. So it would be useful to look at the way bicycles are designed to improve that people can mount and dismount more easily. So the saddle can be adjusted, and Paul has found this bike. It was from the Dutch company Gazelle, and I don't know if they still exist, but yeah, they do. Oh, really? Oh, it's new. Oh, I saw one link on the internet that said, it can't be delivered anymore, but that's just one. All right, well, this could be a kind of bike that will help prevent the mounting and dismounting. Well, of course, I will make it short because I'm out of time. The limitations are, I guess, obvious. If doing a research or a study, a survey, we have a self-reporting bias. It could be that there is. But on the other hand, however, this study, if you conduct a survey, you have many possibilities to ask questions and to gather confounders or possible confounders you can put in the equation that are otherwise not there if you do experimental research, for instance. What we do recommend, and it's, I guess, not new, already been said today, future research should focus on more standard crash databases and travel surveys. And, experimental research is, it's always good to have more research and experimental research, of course. But we are very, very happy and positive that we had an opportunity to do this research amongst the emergency departments in the Netherlands with a survey. So that's, in short, what I have to say.
Thank you so much.